Star Wars: The Heart of the Jedi, Chapter 2. Skywalker's face, though still youthful, seemed prematurely aged by the lines of frustration and regret which now etched it. He tossed the helmet down angrily and spoke to the others in a voice filled with sorrow. Why couldn't they just surrender? A small member of the blue-clad party which had accompanied him into the battle bridge stepped towards him. Slinging its battle rifle, it lifted its hands to remove its own helmet, revealing the still girlish and deceptively innocent face of Princess Leia Organa. Free of the hampering cover, she spoke out to her brother. You know we had no choice, Luke, she told him in her steady, practical way. It's just that more Imperials are trying to stand their ground. We gave them every chance. They just refused. The figure behind her now removed its helmet too, exposing the rugged but good-natured face of Han Solo. He offered assurance in his own breezy manner. Hey, come on, kid. We couldn't let him go. Their fleet's still disorganized. We can't waste a shot at getting every ship we can, even a slug like this one. And then, the other members of the boarding company were now doffing their own helmets and setting about starting cleanup operations on the bridge. Luke, looking around himself again, seemed unconvinced. He shook his head and sighed. I don't know, Han, he said in a weary tone. It just seems like such a waste. I've even lost count of how many I've had to kill in these past few days. Leia wheeled to Luke's side. She lifted a hand to rest upon his arm, and looked up searchingly into his face. A shadow of his own distress swept across his sister's features. I understand, Luke, she said soothingly. I feel the pain in you. It's not so different from my own. Solo stepped up behind her. Well, hell, nobody likes doing this, he offered in a bluff, defensive way. I'm getting kind of sick myself, but if you really want to get this over with, he shrugged, what else can you do? The others on the bridge were by this time busily engaging in checking over bodies, collecting weapons, seeing to wounded, putting out fires, and assessing damage to the controls. Oh, that's a typo there. It says, and accessing damage to the controls, but it should be assessing damage to the controls. One of them left the rest to approach Han. General Solo, he addressed the other smartly. Ship operations are now under our control. Solo turned around to him. Think she'll fly, Captain? He asked. The man shrugged. We'll have to get damage reports on the engines first. Well then, get on it then, Solo ordered. We can't hang around here forever. No telling what other Imperial stuff cruising in this sector. The man gave a salute and moved away, only to be replaced by another, towering figure who entered the bridge and strode towards the three. The shaggy, massive, shaggy being. This needed a little bit more editing, I think. The shaggy, massive, shaggy being that approached was the Wookiee, Chewbacca. His appearance there broke the silent bond of commiseration that had held between Luke and Leia. Both they and Han turned to greet their friend. Chewie! Said Han. Got the rest of the ship secured okay? The Wookiee growled and grunted out a short speech. Han listened in some puzzlement, then translated. A message? Now? From base? Chewie growled out some more. Han listened again, then turned to Leia. Guess it's a priority 1 call, Princess. For you. Leia released Luke's arm. At this, she was swiftly all brisk business again. Can we take it here? Yeah. Han called out to the other men. Hey, where's the comm panel? One of the men gestured to a bank of controls. Han led the way there, carelessly hauled the body of a dead Imperial off the console, and punched a sequence of buttons on the board. A screen above the console flickered to life. Han punched more buttons, and soon the image of a gray-bearded man wavered into clear view. His voice came to them as he apparently saw them too. He sounded relieved. Ah, Princess Leia. We've been trying to reach you for some while. We feared something bad had happened. We were in the midst of a battle, Commodore Nurin, she explained. What is it? No need for any battles now, Princess, the man said with some excitement. There's been a ceasefire. The three before the screen were clearly nonplussed by this. They exchanged wondering looks. What do you mean, Commander? Leia asked forcefully. I mean that since 1 hour ago we've had an unconditional ceasefire. The Empire asked for it, we accepted, all fighting has stopped. As the full import of his words sank in, Luke's face took on a stricken tone. 1 hour ago? He murmured. Leia's own expression remained guarded at the news. Han looked mainly just surprised. The Imperials asked for it? He exclaimed. Well, I'll be. Mon Mothma urgently requests that you return to the new interim base immediately, Princess. Nurin went on. Plans must be made quickly. You can get the details then. She responded briskly. I understand, Commodore. Tell her we're on our way. He looked and his image faded from the screen. Leia looked to Han. How long until we can be away? She asked him. I don't know yet. They're checking on the engine damage and I've got to get a prize crew aboard. Well, if you can't do it quickly, I'm not sure we can take the time, she said. It's more urgent I get back. It can't be so urgent that I leave a Star Destroyer for the Empire to salvage, he replied reasonably. But if there's going to be a peace, she countered, will it matter any more? You ain't any surer of that than I am, sweetheart, he returned. Besides, either way, this thing's worth a big chunk of credits. Leia sighed. I'd hoped the mercenary was all gone from your soul. Once a scoundrel, always a scoundrel, he said, giving her a wink. He bowed and waved invitingly towards the door. So, if you're in a hurry, come help me get this thing moving. All right, Leia acceded grudgingly. The two started away towards the bridge door at a quick pace. Chewbacca fell in behind. As they walked, she continued in an authoritative tone. I'll go back to our ship to arrange for departure. You see to things here as fast as you can. Remember, we need to... Her voice faded as they passed off the bridge. So absorbed with new concerns were they that none noticed Luke Skywalker had remained behind. Still clearly much affected by the new revelation, the young man stood alone, looking about him once again at the many dead. And his expression showed an even more intense regret than before, a greater pain that came from deep within, gripping and wringing him tight. He shook his head and muttered in a voice filled with both sorrow and chagrin. Just 1 hour ago. 1 hour. If we'd only known. The monolithic, triangular slab of the Imperial Super Star Destroyer sailed in menacing grandeur above the glowing curve of the planet Scalar below. On either side of it glided the forms of half a dozen Imperial Star Destroyers, seeming dwarfed now in comparison with the command ship. From the open bay in the belly of the big ship, a tri-winged Lambda-class shuttlecraft suddenly dropped. Its side wings unfurled swiftly, and it soared away, sweeping down a lazy spiral towards the surface of the planet. As it drew nearer to the surface, piercing through gray-white layers of clouds, the outlines of a vast city laid out there came into view. It was a modern but stark-looking metropolis. One might have mistaken it for Coruscant, save that nearly all of the buildings were of utilitarian design, with dark glass and dull metals. They were laid out with severe symmetry, rippling out in precisely spaced concentric rings from round hub. As details of the place began to show more clearly, the nature of individual buildings could be discerned, most especially of the one structure that thrust up from the city's core, and loomed over it in most domineering way. This was the Joint Imperial High Command headquarters for the regional sector known as Kasserine. The building began as a thick square pedestal tapering in stages as it towered skyward to over 500 stories in height. Atop this pedestal, as if some monstrous metal blossom fixed on its rigid stem, perched a sharp-edged and massive pentagon. Its 5 flat sides were striped with the lights from 20 more stories of windows, making the whole soaring building nearly a mile high. The shuttle angled down and across the city toward it, overbearingly forcing a patrolling flight of smaller TIE fighters to scatter like a ruptured flock of birds to avoid its path. It slowed and dropped in towards the huge structure's roof. Here, shielded turbolaser batteries on each of the 5 sides surrounded a central landing area. There was a great deal of rather frenzied activity on and about the area at the moment. More shuttles, TIE fighters, and other small craft were moving about, so thickly as to appear to be near hazards to each other. Some few of them were landing, but the vast majority were departing, and with what looked like a very good deal of haste. The arriving shuttle from the command ship found its way skillfully down through this confusing swarm of craft. It hovered a moment while its wings lifted to landing configuration, then settled softly to a light ringed landing pad. The stomach of the ship cracked open as its long loading ramp dropped to touch the roof. Down the slanting runway, from the inside immediately marched 4 white armored stormtroopers, taking up positions at either side of the base, weapons held at present arms. Behind them, 4 other figures then started down. 3 were in the dark uniforms of the Imperial Command. 2 young officers of a smug and thin-lipped look preceded a somewhat older man, clearly their superior. He was a most imposing figure, tall and spare, long-limbed and ramrod straight, head held proudly erect and commandingly poised. He moved down the ramp with the purposeful stride of one in full, unquestioned control. In the rear walked a 4th figure that could most loosely be dubbed a man. This small and most curious-looking being was man-shaped generally, gawky and cadaverous of build, with skin drawn tight across a death's head face. He was quite hairless and had an eerie blue-white translucence to his flesh. The veins beneath the surface showed as a purplish network, pulsing with the coursing of his blood. Most of this somewhat repulsive form was visible, as he wore only a turban-like headdress and baggy loincloth, even in the chill, stiff breeze at that high altitude. This made quite conspicuous the hazy, softly glowing violet mass of the heart throbbing deep within his breast. As the 4 neared the ramp's base, the tall man pulled up, and the others stopped behind him. He stood looking around him at the landing deck. His lean, strong-featured face was drawn in a hard frown of disapproval. The intense gray eyes set wide on either side of an emphatic hook of a nose, narrowed in displeasure as they took in the scene. About him on the deck all was near chaos. Scores of people were scurrying around, hurriedly readying ships, carrying cargoes of supplies and equipment, and even furniture to load. The majority were obviously abandoning the tower in some haste, and apparently taking anything movable with them. Most were civilians, dressed in the plain and drab-colored garb of imperial bureaucrats. A few wore the cloaks and colored sashes of politicos with some rank. The tall officer's gaze fell upon a chubby and red-faced supervisor, struggling to cope with a herd of anxious, booty-laden folks who crowded about him. The harried official had seemingly taken no note of the new arrivals. Signaling the rest to follow, the officer strode across to him. He stood waiting to be noticed, but the busy supervisor ignored him. He cleared his throat for attention, but the other stayed preoccupied, giving out directions while checking a computerized manifesto in his hands. The officer coughed again, more aggressively. This time, the rotund little man gave a great sigh of exasperation and looked around to him. "Yes," he said in a prim and most put-out way, "and just what do you want?" "I am High Admiral Tharkus," the tall man said, as if that alone should certainly be enough. It wasn't. "Tharkus?" the unimpressed supervisor said, consulting his list. "I wasn't informed you'd be arriving now." "You should have been," the High Admiral said curtly, looking the man up and down. "And who are you?" "I'm Chief Dockmaster Ptommel," said the other with an air of much self-importance. "Now, I'm quite busy," he added dismissingly. "You must notice there's a great deal of confusion here. All the panic since the Emperor's death, and—" Tharkus brusquely cut him off. "That will end right now, Dockmaster. You will see that no more craft depart this base without permission of the High Command." The man gave a laugh at that. He waved about him at the colossal bedlam. "Can you see this? Do you really expect me to stop it?" "I do," Tharkus said domineeringly. "It's my order." Tommel's red face grew redder. "And just who are you to give that order?" he said indignantly. "These are mostly civilian people here, member of the Emperor's government, not of your military. and some of them with a bit of their own rank as well. You have no authority over them, especially now," he added contemptuously. "With the dismal showing you've made defending us." From the hostile looks, agreeing nods, and dark mutterings in those crowded around and watching this exchange, it was clear the rotund supervisor had their strong sympathy. High Admiral Tharkus glanced around them, then back at the little man. "So you refuse to obey me?" he challenged forcefully. "Yes, I do," Tommel said, drawing up to the full of his height, and meeting the still higher gaze defiantly. In response, the High Admiral stepped back, gesturing at the strange, clear-skinned being as he moved behind him. "So be it," he snapped. The being nodded. His violet heart pulsed brighter. His body was instantly enveloped in a sapphire glow, as his preternatural metabolism swiftly absorbed vast quantities of ambient energy from the atmosphere, transforming it into matter. The cocoon of light obscured his image as his figure swelled in moments to a giant size. Just as instantly, the light faded, revealing a monstrous, amphibious being where the man had been. The green-skinned thing squatted on broad haunches, a flat and wide-mouthed head with bulging eyes looming 2 stories above them, on a thick, deeply puckered neck. As the dockmaster stared in astonishment, the head shot forward, the neck stretching out in rubbery ease. The mouth gaped open. The man screamed. It was over in an eye blink. The thing had seized and swallowed Tommel in one gulp. The head had shrunk back onto its body. The only sign left of his chubby form was a round, still wiggling lump in the monster's neck. But another big swallow quickly pushed that down out of sight. The crowd around stood flabbergasted, frozen in shock. Tharkus swept a frizzled gaze around at them. "No one refuses to obey me more than once," he slowly, pointedly told them. Coolly, the High Admiral looked to his officers. "Lieutenant Voss," he said to one, "you and the troopers are to stay here and see my order is obeyed." He nodded towards the creature. "Castor will stay and help you as well." At this, the creature's slavering mouth stretched upwards into a grotesque smile. The people around cringed back from it in horror. Lieutenant Voss saluted in reply to his commander, as Tharkus turned and started briskly walking away, accompanied by his other officer. The 2 men made their way through the milling throng to a central roof structure festooned with surveillance dishes and communications masts. As they moved toward one of a row of doors set in its base, the portal hummed open, revealing a circular lift. The men entered it. Its doors slid closed and lights above it flickered, signaling its descent. In moments, its doors were sliding open again, letting the 2 out into an interior corridor. It was a square and plain-walled hall, its gray sides broken only by regularly spaced doors. Here, the furor on the roof was being repeated. More masses of people in mostly civilian dress swarmed everywhere. Some looking in a great hurry, many looking very concerned. The High Admiral and his men proceeded up the corridor, weaving through others, dodging or stepping over a variety of just as bustling droids. Tharkus cast his keen gaze around him as he walked, taking it all in. Through one open doorway he passed. He caught a glimpse of a busy scene within. The interior of what seemed an office had been torn apart. A small gaggle of frantic women and men were pouring endless masses of record discs into the voracious maw of a vaporizer, a thick square of machinery that gobbled eagerly, like some starved metal monster at its feeding time, and burped loudly as it disintegrated each mouthful. Tharkus shook his head. "This will all have to be stopped at once," he growled ominously. "Yes, High Admiral," his officer crisply agreed. Down a side corridor to its dead end, they marched to reach a large double door. Tharkus beeped a code into a keyboard beside it, and the doors swung inward. The 2 stepped through into a large room. It was a wedge-shaped space widening towards the far end, where long windows looked out at one arc of the city below. Just before the windows sat a sharp-cornered trapezoid of a black metal disc, around which a half-dozen uniformed men stood or sat. These men looked up with startled expressions as the Admiral came in. They were momentarily frozen in tableau, expressions somewhat guilty, even slightly fearful, as if they'd been discovered at something clandestine. But as the Admiral moved forward, expressions of recognition and then relief replaced those of concerns. One square and bull-necked man bellowed out in obvious delight. High Admiral Tharkus! We didn't expect you until tomorrow. The Admiral strode towards them, the officer behind him closing all the doors. I made all possible speed, General Kontos, Tharkus replied. What is it that's happening here? Another wasp-waisted officer spoke up at this. The alarm's been growing here since the destruction of the Death Star, he said in whining tones. Once word spread that the Emperor must be dead, the bureaucracy began collapsing, and word of our fleet's routing by the rebels has added to the chaos. The High Admiral reached the table. He looked around them, face set in hard lines. That chaos ends now. Admiral Dakova, my own flotilla is in orbit above the capital. As ranking officer, I am assuming command. Of what? Dakova said with despair. The remains of our fleet are scattering throughout 3 systems. A temporary setback, Tharkus said confidently. Our combined firepower is still many times that of their ragtag forces. Once all our reserves are activated and we've regrouped, we'll be more than their match. I assure you, our defeat of the rebels should come even more easily now that the Emperor is gone. What do you mean? Asked Kontos. Tharkus looked searchingly around them. Be honest, gentlemen. You all know that the Emperor held the military back. His sole power lay in his use of the Force. Open contempt came into his voice as he went on. He was no tactician, no leader, no fighting man at all. His self-serving strategies were more a hindrance than a help. The officers exchanged nervous glances, but gave grudging nods. Tharkus leaned forward on the table and spoke with sharper, venom-tipped force, thrusting home his point. You all know well how he laughed at us, how he belittled our skills. He charged me with some secondary role and put his pet, Darth Vader, in supreme command. Well, now the military will have its proper place. We will gain control and... You will do nothing, High Admiral, a new voice announced suddenly from behind him. And we will continue that in Chapter 3.